In the vast sun-scorched emptiness of northern Mexico, a concrete skeleton bakes under an indifferent sky. This is what remains of a kingdom, once a fortress complex humming with immense power and guarded paranoia. The ranch now surrenders to the slow, silent siege of the desert. Wind whistles through shattered window panes, carrying dust and the scent of decay, a lonely sound in a place once defined by the noise of absolute authority. It stands not as a monument, but as a scar on the landscape, a testament to an ambition so vast it could only collapse under its own weight. The walls tell a story of violence, both from within and without. Their surfaces, once smooth and imposing, are now a tapestry of cracks, graffiti, and the pockmarks of time. To touch them is to feel the grit of crumbled concrete and the ghost of a sinister purpose. These were not the walls of a home, but of a private nation-state, designed to keep the world out and its dark secrets in. They were the first and last line of defense for a man who trusted nothing and no one, least of all the foundations of his own empire. Watchtowers, cleverly disguised as rustic bell towers or utilitarian water silos, punctuate the perimeter. Today they are hollow eyes staring blankly at the horizon. They no longer scan for federal helicopters or rival incursions. They are merely perches for vultures, silent observers of the ruin below. Their presence speaks to a level of fear that bordered on the theological, a belief that enemies were everywhere, and that salvation could only be found in a fortress of one's own making, a self-contained universe governed by a single volatile will. The grand entryway, designed to project the image of a traditional, benevolent hacienda, is now a scene of profound neglect. The massive iron gates, torn from their hinges, lie half buried in sand and weeds. The long, paved drive that once welcomed armored sedans and the vehicles of corrupt officials is fractured and reclaimed by desert flora. This was the first deception, the architectural lie of pastoral peace, a carefully constructed facade meant to conceal a military-grade operational hub and a heart of methodical cruelty. Inside, the silence is a physical presence. The main residence, a sprawling hall of brutalist design, is a cavern of echoes and dust. Light lances through holes in the roof, illuminating the dance of airborne particles in the still air. The sheer scale of the space speaks of a gargantuan ego, a need to be physically dwarfed by one's own creation. All that remains of its former opulence are faint outlines on the walls where priceless artworks hung, and discolored patches on the floor where Persian rugs once absorbed the sound of footsteps plotting the movement of tons of narcotics. Every detail of the decay is a chapter in the story of the fall. A fragment of Italian marble, spiderwebbed with cracks, crunches underfoot. The cavity in a bathroom wall marks the spot where a gold-plated faucet was violently ripped out by looters. These small acts of desecration are not just theft. They are a symbolic dismantling of a myth. They are the revenge of the powerless on the material culture of a power that once seemed eternal, stripping the palace of its skin until only the bone remained. Crisscrossing the blighted grounds is a network of dry irrigation channels, their concrete arteries cracked and choked with debris. Rusted sprinkler heads aim at ghostly gardens, long since turned to dust. This system was the ranch's central metaphor, a symbol of life and prosperity conjured in the arid landscape. It was a visual promise of growth, mirroring the agricultural genius that industrialized a drug empire. But the water it carried was paid for in blood, and the life it sustained was a monstrous fiction. The very architecture feels dissonant, a deliberate contradiction. The open-air patios and wide verandas of a classic hacienda are fused with the windowless, reinforced concrete of a military bunker. Corridors take sharp, unnatural turns, and some walls feel too thick, too solid, as if they were built to contain screams as much as to repel attacks. The building was a physical manifestation of its owner's mind. One part, charismatic patron, the man of the people, and 9 parts paranoid sovereign, obsessed with control, concealment, and the management of threats. This complex was not simply a home. It was the capital of a clandestine empire. It was built in this remote geography for a reason. Isolation was its greatest asset. Far from prying eyes, beyond the reach of law and consequence, a new set of rules could be written and enforced. Here, The laws of the Mexican state were null and void, replaced by the whims of a single man. The ranch was an attempt to create a separate reality, a sovereign space where power was the only truth and fear was the only law. Beneath the veneer of a luxurious estate, the structure was engineered for a darker purpose. The ground feels unnervingly firm in places, hinting at the subterranean world spoken of in legends and court documents. The whispers of hidden bunkers, of lead-lined meeting rooms, and of escape tunnels are buried in the very blueprint of this place. The house was designed with layers, each one concealing a more terrifying function than the last. It was a labyrinth, intended not only to protect its master, but to ensnare and eliminate his enemies. What began as a monument to a man's ascent from abject poverty to unimaginable wealth became his mausoleum long before his final capture. It was a palace built to insulate him from the consequences of his actions, yet its very existence became the most damning evidence against him. The ranch was a biography written in steel and stone, each expansion and fortification marking a new level of profit, a new enemy made, a deeper descent into the prison of his own paranoia. The ruins tell a clear story of wealth lost and power broken, but the visible decay is only the surface narrative. The true story is not in what has crumbled, but in why it was built with such obsessive, fearful precision in the first place. The opulence was a distraction. The real architecture was one of secrecy and terror, a complex machine designed to facilitate crime and conceal its human cost. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To understand the man who built this fortress and the secrets he buried within it, subscribe and continue this journey into the heart of an empire. Before it was a fortress, it was a feeling, a memory of dust, hunger, and insignificance etched into the mind of a boy from Badiraguato, Sinaloa. The man who would one day command a concrete kingdom began life in a place where the horizon was a cage and the earth offered only grudging survival. His name was Rafael Caro Quintero, and the empire he built was a violent, sprawling answer to the silent humiliations of his youth. The foundation of his fortress was not laid in the desert soil, but in the barren ground of his own past. Poverty in the Sierra Madre is not a simple absence of wealth. It is a physical presence. It is the grit of the soil under the fingernails, the ache of an empty stomach, the oppressive weight of a future already written. For a young Caro Quintero, the world was a closed system of inherited hardship. He was one of many siblings, born into a family of subsistence farmers, where the cycle of planting and failing to prosper was the only known catechism. His inheritance was not land or money, but a profound understanding of powerlessness. This understanding was sharpened into a weapon by premature responsibility. The death of his father thrust him into the role of patriarch as a teenager, ending any notion of childhood. He learned a fundamental lesson of his environment. The world does not give, it must be taken. Survival was not a matter of morality, but of ingenuity and force. The established laws were constructs of a distant, indifferent government. The only real law was the one that put food on the table. In this landscape of scarcity, one crop offered an escape velocity: marijuana. It was not an ideological choice or an act of rebellion. It was a pragmatic agricultural decision. The plant grew where legitimate hope could not, a hardy weed that promised a return far greater than corn or beans. For Caro Quintero, it was simply a different kind of harvest, one that required the same intimate knowledge of soil, sun, and water that his ancestors had possessed for generations. His first forays into the trade were small, rooted in the land he knew so well. He was not a strategist plotting in a boardroom. He was a farmer learning a new and dangerous market. He understood the cycles of growth, the logistics of irrigation, and the quality of the product. His intelligence was practical, instinctual, and tied to the earth. He was an agrarian innovator whose field of expertise happened to be the cultivation of a federally banned substance. This connection to the soil would define his entire criminal enterprise. The first significant profits were more than just money. They were a potent antidote to a lifetime of shame. Wealth brought a form of respect, or at least a deference that resembled it, that he had never known. It was a currency that could purchase influence, silence critics, and most importantly, begin to erase the memory of his own insignificance. This sensation was not merely satisfying, it was addictive. He did not simply want more wealth. He developed an insatiable need for the power it conferred. The transition from subsistence grower to organized trafficker was marked by a series of moral tipping points, each one crossed with cold pragmatism. The first act of serious violence, the first bribe paid to a local commander, the first betrayal of a rival, these were not moments of dramatic crisis. They were calculated business decisions, the necessary costs of expansion in an industry with no legal recourse. He learned that fear was a more reliable tool than loyalty, and that a reputation for brutality was a valuable asset. As his influence grew, so did a carefully constructed persona, the patron. He saw himself as a modern feudal lord, a benevolent provider for his community, who also acted as its ruthless enforcer. He financed local fiestas, built churches, and handed out cash to the needy, cultivating a base of social support that served as a human shield. This generosity was not altruism. It was a strategic investment in his own security and a performance of the legitimacy he craved. Yet beneath the performance of the confident patron, a deep-seated inferiority complex festered. Uneducated and from a background of extreme rural poverty, he felt like an imposter among the truly powerful, the corrupt politicians and established elites with whom he now did business. This internal fracture was masked by an exaggerated machismo, a volatile temper, and outrageous displays of wealth. He demanded respect because he never felt he had truly earned it. It was from this psychological wound that the vision for the ranch was born. It would not be just a home or a hideout, it would be a declaration. It would be a physical monument to his arrival, a fortress so immense and undeniable that it would force the world to acknowledge his power. He would carve his own nation-state out of the same indifferent desert that had once threatened to consume him, building a reality where he was not just a participant, but the sole creator of the law. The dream was of absolute sovereignty. He envisioned a self-contained universe, buffered from the outside world by high walls and armed guards. Inside this perimeter, his will would be absolute. It would be a space engineered for total control, where every sightline was managed, every entry point was monitored, and every potential threat could be neutralized. The architecture taking shape in his mind was not just one of luxury, but one of profound, suffocating paranoia. He began to study the symbols of old power, the grand haciendas of the wealthy landowners who had for centuries ruled the Mexican countryside. He would appropriate their architectural language of arches, courtyards, and verandas, but he would fuse it with the brutalist functionality of a military bunker. His creation would be a hybrid, a deliberate contradiction, a palace designed for pleasure that was, at its core, a machine built for war. The first parcel of land was acquired with purpose. He chose a location not for its beauty or convenience, but for its isolation. Remoteness was the ultimate luxury, the key strategic asset that would allow him to build and operate without witnesses. Far from the prying eyes of federal agents and rival organizations, he could construct his alternate reality, a kingdom governed by its own physics of power and consequence. The initial construction was modest, a small compound that reflected his status at the time. But the blueprint in his imagination was already sprawling across thousands of acres. The project became an obsession, a living entity that grew in lockstep with his own power. Every major drug shipment financed a new wing. Every new enemy necessitated a thicker wall or a taller watchtower. The ranch became a physical ledger of his ascent. This ever-expanding complex was more than a strategic headquarters or a decadent retreat. It was the materialization of a psychological need. It was an attempt to build a structure so solid, so permanent, and so imposing that it could protect him not only from his enemies, but from the persistent ghost of his own origins. The fortress was designed to contain his power, but its true purpose was to contain his fear. The ranch was, therefore, a biography written in concrete and steel. Its foundations were sunk deep into the earth, but its design was drawn from the internal architecture of one man's ambition and anxiety. Every hidden room, every escape tunnel, every reinforced wall was a testament to a mind that trusted nothing and no one. The kingdom was being built not as a monument to success, but as a desperate, colossal defense against the memory of being powerless. The growth of the empire was not recorded in ledgers, but in limestone, concrete, and steel. The first structures on the desert property were brutally pragmatic, reflecting a business still rooted in agrarian logic. They were little more than fortified barns and a modest residence, built for function, not fantasy. This was the architecture of a successful farmer, a man whose wealth was still measured in harvests. The walls were thick, but they were built to insulate against the desert heat, not to repel an army. The initial compound was a statement of presence, not yet a declaration of sovereignty. This changed with an agricultural innovation that would revolutionize the North American drug trade. By applying industrial-scale irrigation and cultivating a potent seedless strain of marijuana known as sinsemilla, Caro Quintero transformed his operation from a regional concern into a continental supplier. The profits were exponential, and the ranch began to swell. The first expansion was not one of luxury, but of logistics. Larger storehouses, workshops for vehicles, and barracks. Style housing for a growing army of laborers and guards appeared, mirroring the structure of a large-scale agricultural enterprise. The formation of the Guadalajara Cartel was the next catalyst. The Federation, a strategic alliance with Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, consolidated trafficking routes and, more importantly, centralized the purchasing of political protection. This new corporate structure demanded a more formidable headquarters. It was then that the first Great Wall was erected, a 10-foot-high barrier of reinforced concrete that encircled the core compound. It was a profound architectural statement, the demarcation of a new territory, a line drawn in the sand between the cartel's domain and the laws of Mexico. With federal protection secured through massive bribes, the ranch became more than a headquarters. It became a sanctuary. The money flowing from the cartel's unified operations financed the first true expressions of personal ego. A new residential wing was built, its design mimicking the grand haciendas of the old ruling class, an act of appropriation and defiance. Wide verandas, shaded courtyards, and hand-carved wooden doors were incorporated, a performance of legitimacy and heritage for a man who had neither. Then came the cocaine. The partnership with the Colombian cartels opened a fire hose of cash that made the marijuana profits seem quaint. This new tier of wealth demanded a new architectural language, one of secrecy and indulgence. An underground party room was excavated beneath the main residence, a soundproofed cavern with its own bar and ventilation system. Here, far from any possibility of surveillance, deals could be sealed and decadent celebrations held, a subterranean world built to contain the volatile energy of limitless money. This influx of new power also brought new and more dangerous enemies. After surviving an assassination attempt, Caro Quintero's latent paranoia became the ranch's chief architect. The compound began to harden, to retract into itself. The ornamental iron gates were replaced with solid steel plates. The windows of the main residence were fitted with thick, bulletproof glass, transforming vistas of the desert into secure, sealed portals. The open verandas were now surveyed by discreetly placed cameras. The watchtowers were the most significant addition of this period. Disguised as rustic water towers or the bell towers of a mission chapel, they were a masterstroke of psychological warfare and tactical defense. Manned 24 hours a day by guards with high-powered rifles, they offered overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. They transformed the ranch from a fortified estate into a military installation, a physical manifestation of a siege mentality. The facade of the benevolent hacienda was now merely camouflage for a fortress. As the empire's logistical needs grew, so did the ranch's infrastructure. A private airstrip, initially a simple dirt runway for small planes, was paved and extended, capable of handling the cargo aircraft that now moved tons of narcotics and millions of dollars in cash. Adjacent hangars were constructed to house a growing fleet, shielding the cartel's air force from satellite surveillance and the prying eyes of unauthorized flyovers. The ranch was becoming a self-contained logistical hub, an independent port in the middle of the desert. Inside the main residence, the cocaine wealth funded a lavish interior redesign. Floors of Italian marble were laid, and bathrooms were fitted with gold-plated fixtures. Precious woods were imported for paneling and furniture. This was not the taste of old money, but the desperate assertion of a man who measured his worth in the sheer weight of his possessions. Every surface had to proclaim his arrival, to shout down the persistent whisper of his impoverished origins. The expansion was chaotic, almost organic, lacking a single unifying vision beyond the immediate needs of power, paranoia, and vanity. New wings were grafted onto existing structures, corridors took sharp, illogical turns, and some interior walls were thickened for no apparent reason other than to create hidden compartments. The ranch was becoming a labyrinth, a physical representation of its owner's increasingly complex and compartmentalized mind. It was a structure designed to confuse intruders and conceal secrets. The irrigation system, the symbolic heart of the enterprise, was also upgraded. What began as a network to sustain marijuana fields evolved into an elaborate life support system for the fortress. It fed a man-made lake, stocked with exotic fish, and watered lush gardens and polo fields that seemed to defy the desert itself. This manufactured oasis was the ultimate display of power, the ability to conjure life and luxury in a landscape of death and scarcity, all financed by the inverse flow of drugs north. Beneath the manicured lawns and ornamental gardens, a second, more sinister construction project was underway. A network of concrete bunkers and subterranean tunnels began to spread like roots beneath the complex. These were not mere storm shelters. They were designed for prolonged siege, equipped with independent power, water, and communication systems. They were the ranch's hidden skeleton, a secret geography of fear. The dual function of the ranch was now perfected. On the surface, it was a stage for extravagant parties, where politicians and businessmen mingled under the desert stars. It hosted weddings, baptisms, and fiestas, projecting an image of a powerful but benevolent community leader. The performance was flawless, the hospitality legendary. The ranch presented itself as a center of regional life and prosperity. But in the lead-lined rooms of the underground bunkers, the true business of the empire was conducted. Here, strategy was plotted, rivals were sentenced, and torture was administered. The same structure that hosted a child's birthday party on its lawn contained chambers in its depths where men were systematically dismantled. The architectural separation of these two worlds was absolute, allowing the illusion of normalcy to mask the machinery of terror. With his power at its apex in the early 1980s, Caro Quintero indulged in the ultimate act of a self-made monarch. He built a private zoo. Exotic animals, panthers, tigers, and rare birds, were imported and housed in opulent enclosures. They were living trophies, symbols of a power so vast it could possess the wild, caging nature itself as another luxury commodity. The roars of captive predators echoed across the compound, a fitting soundtrack for the kingdom. The ranch was now a city-state, a monument to a single indomitable will. It had its own economy, its own army, its own laws, and its own mythology. It was the physical culmination of a boy's dream to escape the dust of Badiraguato, a dream that had metastasized into a nightmare of concrete and paranoia. The fortress was complete, a perfect machine for generating wealth and containing fear. Every addition was a chapter in its builder's biography. The simple adobe of the farmer gave way to the marble of the king. The open fields were enclosed by the walls of the warlord. The humble home became the labyrinth of the fugitive. The architecture was a direct transcription of a life's trajectory, from powerless to omnipotent. The complex had reached its final, monstrous form. It was a hybrid of palace, fortress, and industrial park, a sprawling testament to an ambition that recognized no limits. It stood under the Chihuahuan sun, not just as a collection of buildings, but as a challenge to the world, a declaration that a new power had been born, one that built its own reality. This finished kingdom, however, was also a perfect prison. Each new security measure, each hidden chamber, each layer of reinforced concrete was another bar on the cage. The man who had built a fortress to control his world had in the process sealed himself inside it, a sovereign trapped within the architecture of his own success. The ranch was a biography written in stone, but its narrative was one of escalating isolation. The higher the walls grew, the smaller the world outside became. The deeper the bunkers were dug, the more terrifying the shadows grew. The structure, designed to project absolute power, was, in reality, a colossal monument to absolute fear. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity? The marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? By the dawn of the 1980s, the kingdom was complete. The ranch no longer felt like a construction site, but a permanent living monolith, a declaration of defiance carved into the Chihuahuan desert. It was the physical manifestation of a power that believed itself to be absolute, a finished monument to an empire at its zenith. The raw concrete of its early days was now softened by manicured gardens, the dust of construction replaced by the scent of irrigated prosperity. The illusion was perfected, the stage set for the final act of a tragic reign. The ranch awoke each day not as a fortress, but as a theater. Its daily life was a meticulously choreographed performance of legitimacy. Hundreds of staff, gardeners, stable hands, cooks, and cleaners moved with quiet efficiency, maintaining the facade of a grand traditional hacienda. Trucks arrived not with weapons, but with fresh produce and fine wines. The sounds were of commerce and life, the thrum of a prosperous estate, a carefully constructed normalcy designed to mask the monstrous engine at its core. The nights belonged to spectacle. Lavish parties became legendary, drawing a constellation of the powerful and the compromised. State governors, federal police commanders, military generals, and wealthy businessmen would arrive in convoys of armored vehicles, their presence a public endorsement of the man who hosted them. They came to pay homage, to reaffirm allegiances, and to partake in a generosity so immense it functioned as a form of subjugation. Music from live bands drifted over manicured lawns, mingling with the scent of roasted goat and the distant guttural roars of the caged panthers. Guests drank vintage champagne from crystal flutes, while armed guards, dressed discreetly as ranch hands, watched from the shadows of the verandas. The atmosphere was a volatile mixture of festive abandon and suffocating tension, a place where a toast could seal a man's fortune, or a misplaced word could condemn him. Every smile was a calculation, every embrace a measurement of loyalty. These gatherings were not celebrations, they were audits of allegiance, rituals of power designed to reinforce the hierarchy. Caro Quintero would move through the crowds as the benevolent patron, slapping backs, dispensing favors, and telling crude jokes. But his eyes were constantly scanning, assessing, judging. The parties were a tool for intelligence gathering, a stage where loyalties were tested and weaknesses were exposed under the disinhibiting influence of alcohol and feigned friendship. But the theater was contained within a fortress, and its security apparatus operated with the cold precision of a military state. The performance of openness ended abruptly at the perimeter wall. The daily routine of the ranch's private army was a stark contrast to the pastoral illusion within. The changing of the guard, the sweeping patrols of the desert approaches, the meticulous inspection of every vehicle. These were the unyielding rhythms that underscored every moment of life inside the compound. From the disguised watchtowers, the world was reduced to a series of potential threats. Manned by snipers with night vision scopes and encrypted radios, these elevated positions were the kingdom's all-seeing eyes. Their overlapping fields of fire ensured that no inch of the perimeter was unobserved. The guards were not just watching for external enemies, they were also watching the staff, the guests and each other. The surveillance was total, a closed circuit of institutionalized mistrust. This paranoia was woven into the very infrastructure. Beyond the visible cameras that dotted the walls, a more insidious network of hidden microphones and miniature lenses was embedded within the main residence itself. Guest suites, common areas, even the ornamental gardens were wired for sound and video. No conversation was truly private, no allegiance taken on faith. The man who demanded absolute loyalty trusted no one, and the architecture was his accomplice in this universal suspicion. The true throne room of this empire was not in the grand hall with its priceless art, but deep beneath the earth. A lead-lined boardroom, shielded from any form of electronic eavesdropping, was the sanctum sanctorum. Here, in the sterile, windowless quiet, the real business was conducted. The air was thick with the cold calculus of logistics, profit margins, and acceptable losses. It was a space devoid of emotion, a chamber for pure, unadulterated strategy. Here, insulated from the world, the cartography of a continental drug network was drawn. Meetings with emissaries from the Medellin Cartel were held to coordinate cocaine shipments. Bribe menus for high-ranking DFS commanders were finalized. The fates of rivals and traitors were decided with a clinical detachment that would have been impossible in the performative theater above ground. This subterranean chamber was the Empire's brain, a place of silent, terrifying clarity. Beneath the living quarters, a different kind of wealth was entombed. Climate-controlled bunkers, accessible only through hidden panels and secret elevators, stored the Empire's liquid assets. Pallets stacked high with American currency shared space with crates of military-grade assault rifles, grenades, and anti-aircraft munitions. This was the material reality of the cartel's power, buried and quantified, a dragon's hoard awaiting a war that its owner felt was perpetually imminent. The ultimate expression of this reign was not in gold or marble, but in the flesh and blood of the private zoo. Tigers, lions, and jaguars paced in enclosures far more luxurious than the homes of the men who guarded them. These creatures were not pets. They were living symbols of a power that could dominate the wild, that could possess and cage the most fearsome aspects of nature. Their roars were a nightly reminder of the predator who presided over this domain, a man who saw himself reflected in their caged ferocity. The ranch's pulse was the roar of aircraft engines. The private airstrip was the main artery of the empire, a constant hub of activity. Small planes used for domestic logistics landed alongside heavy cargo craft, returning from clandestine runways along the U.S. border. They brought back mountains of cash and delivered the raw materials of the trade. The airstrip made the ranch more than a hideout. It made it an independent logistical port, a sovereign hub in a global criminal enterprise. The population of this city-state was divided into two classes, the masters and the silent. The staff, many from local villages, were paid sums that transformed their families' lives. But this generosity came with an unspoken contract of absolute silence and compartmentalized ignorance. They were trained to see nothing, to hear nothing, to know nothing beyond their specific duties. They understood that the walls had ears and that curiosity was a fatal disease. They were both beneficiaries and prisoners of the kingdom. The symbolic heart of the ranch, the irrigation system, now operated at peak capacity. Water drawn from deep aquifers flowed ceaselessly through concrete channels, feeding the artificial lake, the polo fields, and the emerald green lawns. This manufactured Eden in the heart of the desert was the ultimate projection of power, the godlike ability to command life, to make the barren earth bloom. It was a beautiful, hypnotic lie, a vibrant green mask painted over a foundation of death. The master of this domain moved through it with the restless energy of a caged predator. He would inspect his horses at dawn, preside over target practice with his personal guard in the afternoon, and host lavish dinners at night. Yet he was rarely still, rarely at peace. His movements were a constant patrol of his own creation, a need to physically touch and see the components of his power, as if to reassure himself that it was all real, that the walls were still standing. For all its population and activity, the ranch was the loneliest place on earth. The owner was surrounded by sycophants, employees, and family, but he was insulated from genuine human connection by a wall of fear and suspicion, far more formidable than the one made of concrete. He had built a world that revolved entirely around him, yet he was its sole true inhabitant, an emperor ruling over a kingdom of shadows. This psychological schism was mirrored in the compound's daily life. It was a place where, on the same afternoon, say a priest might be brought in to perform a baptism on the main lawn, while in a soundproofed cellar 200 yards away, a rival was being tortured with a level of methodical cruelty that defied imagination. The architecture was designed to facilitate this grotesque duality, to ensure that the sounds of celebration would never mix with the sounds of agony. The fortress, designed as the ultimate sanctuary, had become the perfect prison. The high walls, the armed guards, and the ceaseless surveillance were not just to keep enemies out, they were to keep the king in. He was a captive of the very security systems he had built, his movements confined to a gilded cage of his own design. To leave the ranch was to become vulnerable, to re-enter a world where he was not the law. When the music stopped and the guests departed, a different soundscape emerged. The desert wind would whisper through the empty courtyards, carrying the lonely cries from the zoo. The silence was not peaceful but heavy, charged with the unconfessed secrets and unspeakable acts the compound was built to contain. It was in these hours that the ranch revealed its true nature as a mausoleum of a living man. He had achieved a state of perceived invincibility, a dangerous delusion fostered by the absolute control he exerted over his immediate environment. The sycophancy of his lieutenants, the deference of corrupt officials, and the physical impenetrability of his fortress all conspired to create a myth of his own omnipotence. He was the Sun King of Sinaloa, and his palace in the desert was the center of the universe. But power on this scale creates its own gravity, pulling distant, unforeseen objects into its orbit. While the parties raged and the prophets soared, a quiet, methodical DEA agent was taking up a new post in Guadalajara. He was a minor variable in a vast equation, an insignificant threat to a king in his castle. Yet his arrival marked the beginning of a subtle shift in the cosmos, an invisible line being drawn that would lead directly to the gates of the fortress. The system of power, for all its concrete and steel, was a delicate ecosystem. It depended on a precise balance of fear, bribery, and perceived omnipotence. For years the equilibrium held, but in the wider world, beyond the watchtowers and the desert horizon, new variables were entering the equation. A force was gathering, one that did not operate on the logic of bribes or intimidation. It was methodical, patient, and institutional. It was the quiet, grinding machinery of American law enforcement, and it had found a new focus. This focus took the form of a man. His name was Enrique Camarena, a special agent for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. He was not a dramatic figure of cinematic legend, but something far more dangerous. A diligent, unassuming analyst of systems, he did not see a mythical king in a castle. He saw a logistical network with supply lines, vulnerabilities, and pressure points. His weapon was not a rifle, but information, patiently gathered and meticulously cross-referenced. While the fortress pulsed with the rhythms of its own self-contained universe, Camarena moved through the cartel's periphery, mapping its invisible architecture. He cultivated informants not with grand promises, but with the quiet assurance of a state that had a longer memory than any one man. He was tracing the irrigation canals of the empire back to their source, looking for the pump that drove the entire enterprise. He understood that a fortress is only as strong as the economy that sustains it. Inside the compound, this external threat was abstract, distant, a problem for the lawyers and accountants in Guadalajara. The daily reality was one of absolute control. The ranch had become a sensory deprivation chamber, amplifying the sound of its owner's voice while muffling the warnings from the outside world. The sycophants who formed the inner circle reported only good news, reflecting the master's own myth of invincibility back at him. The walls designed to keep enemies out now served to keep reality at bay. This self-imposed isolation bred a fatal arrogance. The systematic corruption of the Mexican Federal Security Directorate was seen not as a temporary alliance of convenience, but as a permanent and unbreakable shield. Caro Quintero believed he had purchased the state itself, that its institutions were now just another subsidiary of his enterprise. He saw the official credentials carried by his gunmen as proof of legitimacy, failing to understand they were merely rented symbols of a power that could be revoked at any moment. The delusion of permanence was so complete that the slow decay of the physical structure went unnoticed. A hairline fracture appeared in the concrete of the western perimeter wall, a faint spiderweb pattern caused by the earth settling beneath the immense weight of the fortification. It was a minor flaw, insignificant to the untrained eye, but it was a sign that even the most solid foundations are subject to invisible pressures. The earth itself was beginning to register the strain. The symbolic heart of the ranch, the elaborate irrigation system, also began to show its age. A valve in a secondary canal rusted shut, causing a small overflow that turned a patch of manicured lawn into a muddy swamp for days before it was repaired. The ceaseless flow of life-giving water, the metaphor for the empire's unending cash flow, was interrupted. It was the first sign of entropy. a suggestion that the complex machine could, in fact, break down. The first true fissure in the empire's wall of silence came not from a high-level betrayal, but from the accumulated resentment of the powerless. A low-level ranch hand, his family threatened by a rival trafficker, saw an opportunity for leverage. A whisper to a local police contact, who in turn had a contact within a rival faction, set in motion a slow, unstoppable leak of information. It was not a flood, but a steady drip of operational details: the schedule of fuel deliveries for the aircraft, the name of a favored pilot, the location of a remote storage barn. This information, seemingly trivial, acted as a solvent on the cartel's mystique of omniscience. It proved that the organization was not a monolith, but a collection of fallible human beings, some of whom were becoming more afraid of their master than they were of his enemies. The currency of fear, when overspent, begins to lose its value. Other whispers followed, emboldened by the first. These trickles of intelligence found their way through a chain of intermediaries and informants to the desk of Enrique Camarena. They were the missing pieces of his puzzle, the ground-level truths that confirmed his analytical models. He began to see the empire not as a fortress, but as a series of interconnected and vulnerable nodes. The most significant of these was not the command and control center in the desert, but the source of its agricultural wealth. He had located the heart. It was a property of almost unimaginable scale in Chihuahua, known as the Buffalo Ranch. It was not a fortress, but a vast open-air factory covering thousands of acres, where the Sinsemilla strain was being cultivated on an industrial scale. This was the true source of the power that had built the marble bathrooms and the private zoo. It was the empire's exposed and vital organ. On November 6, 1984, acting on the precise intelligence provided by Camarena, 450 Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, descended on the Buffalo Ranch. They met little resistance. The workers were farmers, not soldiers. The scale of what they found was beyond anything the authorities had imagined. Nearly 10,000 tons of high-grade marijuana were seized and put to the torch. The smoke created a pall that hung over the Chihuahuan desert for days, a funeral pyre for a significant portion of the Guadalajara cartel's annual revenue. The news of the raid did not arrive at the fortress through official channels. It came as a frantic, garbled radio call from a scout who had witnessed the helicopters. The financial loss was catastrophic, estimated in the billions of dollars, but the psychological impact was even greater. An attack of this magnitude was not supposed to be possible. It was a violation of the fundamental laws of their universe, a direct consequence of a leak that had originated somewhere deep within the system. The fortress, once a symbol of impenetrable security, now felt like a trap. The very silence of the compound became menacing. Every shadow in the courtyard seemed to hold a traitor. Every loyal employee was now a potential informant. The paranoia that had been the chief architect of the ranch now turned inward, consuming its creator. The enemy was no longer just outside the walls. The enemy was now inside. Caro Quintero's response was not that of a calculated strategist, but of a wounded predator. The loss of the Buffalo Ranch was not a business setback. It was a profound personal humiliation, an insult to his very identity as the undisputed king of the harvest. His rage was volcanic, and it demanded a singular focus. He did not ask which system had failed. He asked which man had dared to defy him. The name Camarena, once an obscure file in the cartel's security briefings, now became an obsession. In the cold, lead-lined quiet of the subterranean boardroom, the cartel's leadership gathered. The atmosphere was no longer one of confident strategic planning, but of a vengeful war council. The complex calculus of risk and reward was abandoned, replaced by a primal need for retribution. The methodical investigation by one man had inflicted more damage than any rival cartel ever had. He had bypassed the walls, ignored the watchtowers, and struck at the empire's economic foundation. He had proven that the king was not a god, and for this heresy a decision was made. The agent would be taken, he would be made to suffer. He would be forced to reveal the names of those who had betrayed the organization. This decision, born of wounded pride in the depths of the fortress, was the most significant crack of all. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a declaration of war not against a rival, but against a sovereign nation. The organization was turning its machinery of terror against the very force that had been quietly documenting its every move. The walls of the ranch were built to withstand a siege from the outside. They had not been designed to contain the explosive, self-destructive force of their owner's own ego. In signing the death warrant for one man, the master of the fortress had inadvertently signed the demolition order for his entire kingdom. The ground beneath the foundations was beginning to give way. The murder of a federal agent was not the culmination of power, but its terminal diagnosis. In the immediate aftermath, a profound and unnatural quiet descended upon the fortress. It was not the silence of peace, but the sound of a vacuum. The stillness that follows a catastrophic pressure change. The phone lines that once crackled with the commerce of corruption went dead. The usual convoys of deferential politicians ceased their pilgrimages. The fortress, once the center of a universe, was suddenly and completely cut adrift, an island in a hostile sea. The American response was not a declaration of war, but the activation of an immense impersonal machine. Operation Leyenda was its name, and its nature was bureaucratic, methodical, and relentless. It was a force that could not be bribed, intimidated, or assassinated. It moved not with the speed of a bullet, but with the grinding, inexorable power of tectonic plates. It applied pressure through diplomatic channels, economic sanctions, and intelligence sharing, slowly tightening a noose around the Mexican government and forcing it to sever its ties with its most powerful criminal syndicate. The first to abandon the king were his knights. The high-ranking officials of the DFS, who had for years acted as the cartel's private army, now saw him as a liability of catastrophic proportions. Their loyalty was a function of profit and self-preservation, and the equation had irrevocably shifted. The same men who once provided his motorcades now shared intelligence on his movements. The state, which he believed he had purchased, was repossessing itself, and its first act was to disown its most notorious tenant. Inside the compound, the atmosphere curdled from paranoia into a state of siege psychosis. The master of the ranch, now a fugitive within his own walls, saw betrayal in every shadow. The loyalty of his private army, once absolute, began to fray under the certainty of the coming storm. The staff moved with a new fearful silence, their eyes downcast, their minds calculating the odds of survival. The fortress, designed to manage external threats, had become a pressure cooker for internal collapse. The siege began not with a ground assault, but with a sound, the rhythmic, percussive beat of helicopter blades slicing through the desert air. It was a sound the ranch was accustomed to, but these were not the cartel's aircraft. They were military helicopters, circling like birds of prey, their presence a constant, unnerving reminder that the sky was no longer a private highway but a hostile frontier. They did not attack. They simply watched, their surveillance turning the sanctuary into a fishbowl. When the ground forces finally came, they did not lay siege to the walls. They drove straight to the massive steel gates which were opened for them from the inside. The final, most intimate betrayal had occurred. The architectural pretense of the Grand Hacienda was shattered as armored personnel carriers and trucks filled with federal soldiers rolled down the long drive, their heavy tires crushing the carefully manicured verges. The performance of pastoral peace was over. The interior of the main residence was violated by the methodical chaos of a raid. Teams of soldiers and federal agents clad in tactical gear fanned out through the marble halls. Their muddy boots scuffed the polished floors, their shouted commands echoing in spaces once reserved for whispered conspiracies. The sheer opulence of the surroundings, the silk tapestries, the pre-Columbian artifacts, the handcrafted furniture, served only to amplify the brutal utilitarianism of the invasion. The house began to surrender its secrets under duress. An agent, tapping along a paneled wall in the master study, heard a hollow echo. With the butt of a rifle, the precious wood was splintered, revealing not a safe but the clean modern seam of a hidden door. The architecture of concealment, so carefully designed, was being crudely and unceremoniously dismantled. The walls themselves were being forced to testify. Behind the false wall was not a vault of gold, but something far more valuable to the investigators, an office. In this secret chamber, insulated from the rest of the house, were rows of filing cabinets. Inside were the ledgers, the meticulous accounting of the empire's finances, names, dates, and figures detailing bribe payments to judges, police commanders, and politicians. The paper trail, the one thing that could not be buried in the desert, had been found. The desecration of the material symbols of power was systematic. Priceless paintings were ripped from the walls, not to be seized as assets, but to check for hidden compartments behind them, leaving ghostly rectangles on the bare plaster. The art was no longer art. It was merely a potential container for evidence, its cultural value erased by its criminal context. Heavy steel safes, embedded in the concrete of the cellar walls, were opened not with stethoscopes and patient hands, but with plasma torches that filled the subterranean air with the scent of burnt metal. The locks, designed to protect the wealth of an empire, were melted into slag. Their contents, stacks of American dollars, deeds to properties, and jewelry, were unceremoniously dumped into evidence bags. The search became an excavation. Convinced of the existence of a deeper subterranean level, agents brought in jackhammers. The floors of Italian marble, once the ultimate symbol of Caro Quintero's arrival, were shattered. The brutal noise of the machinery was an assault on the house's very soul, its luxurious skin peeled back to expose the raw concrete skeleton beneath. The palace was being autopsied. This violent deconstruction eventually revealed what the blueprints and informants had promised. A section of the wine cellar floor, when broken, exposed the entrance to a reinforced tunnel. The escape routes, the architectural embodiment of the owner's perpetual fear, had been breached. They were no longer paths to freedom, but dark corridors leading the state into the most secret recesses of the kingdom. The private zoo became a scene of abject neglect. The exotic predators, once living trophies of an ultimate power, paced in their cages, their roars now sounding less like threats and more like cries of hunger and confusion. Their master was gone, their keepers had fled, and they were left as the last. Forgotten prisoners of a collapsed regime, their gilded cages now their tombs. The heart of the ranch was the last thing to die. An engineer acting on a court order descended into the pump house and threw the master switch. The complex irrigation system sputtered and went silent. The ceaseless flow of water, the lifeblood of the artificial Eden, stopped. Within days, the emerald green lawns began to yellow, the exotic flowers in the gardens wilted, and the surface of the artificial lake began to recede, revealing a muddy, barren scar. Once the official raid was over, a second, more intimate invasion began. Looters, emboldened by the collapse of authority, descended on the property. They were the local people, some of whom had once benefited from the patron's largesse. They stripped the remaining fixtures, tore copper wiring from the walls, and pried the gold-plated faucets from the bathrooms. It was not just theft, it was a reclamation, a final symbolic dismantling of the myth. The fortress was no longer a home, a headquarters, or even a ruin. It had become a crime scene. Every broken window, every shattered piece of marble, every empty cage was an exhibit. The structure, which had been built to conceal and enable a vast criminal enterprise, was now its most eloquent and damning prosecutor. The man himself was gone, a ghost hunted across the continent, but he had left his biography behind, written in 10-foot walls and lead-lined rooms. The fortress, designed to be a monument to his permanence, had become the most detailed evidence of his crimes and the most enduring symbol of his fall. It stood now not as a testament to his power, but as a permanent record of its profound and inevitable failure. So, where does power truly reside? In concrete, or in what survives its fall? To witness the final verdict of the desert and uncover the legacy of this fallen kingdom, subscribe and join us for the conclusion of this story. The desert offers no eulogies, it simply reclaims. Today the fortress is a carcass picked clean, its concrete bones bleaching under the same indifferent sun that once nurtured an empire. Seized by a state it once owned, its true sentence was not demolition, but abandonment. It was left to the slow, patient siege of wind and time, a punishment of profound insignificance. The silence that now occupies its halls is not an absence of sound, but the final, settled presence of consequence. The kingdom has not just fallen, it has been erased from the ledger of the living. Nature's repossession is methodical and absolute. Weeds, the hardiest of pioneers, force their way through cracks in the marble floors. The artificial lake, once a shimmering testament to the power to conjure life, is now a cracked basin of mud and desiccated reeds. The empty cages of the private zoo, their bars rusted and bent, are monuments to a captive ferocity that has long since perished. The walls are a canvas for graffiti, crude epitaphs scrawled by ghosts and vandals, the final and most democratic form of commentary on a power that once tolerated no dissent. The irrigation system, the empire's central metaphor, has surrendered its function. Its concrete arteries are choked with sand, its network of pipes and valves seized by rust. The sprinklers, once casting life-giving arcs of water over impossible lawns, now stand like skeletal, unseeing sentinels aiming at a ground that has forgotten the memory of green. The ceaseless flow that symbolized an unending stream of wealth has run dry, leaving behind only the architecture of a dead ambition, a testament to a harvest that ultimately consumed its sour. The man who built this reality became a fugitive from it. Captured and sentenced, Rafael Caro Quintero was entombed in the state's prison system for 28 years. Then, in a final bizarre twist of a corruptible system, a judicial technicality set him free. He walked out not as a king returning to his throne, but as a ghost into a world that had remade itself in his absence. He was a relic, a name from a bloodier, simpler time, hunted by the ghosts of his own past and the relentless institutional memory of his enemies. His freedom was a brief epilogue. In 2022, the legend was finally cornered and caged. He was found not in a palace or a bunker, but in the rugged mountains of his youth, the landscape that had first forged his ambition. The man who commanded a private air force and an army of sicarios was captured without a single shot fired, his reign ending not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs on aging wrists. The Sun King of Sinaloa was now just an old man, a prisoner of the state he once sought to buy and the nation he sought to defy. The ranch, meanwhile, has passed into folklore. For the people who live in the shadow of its ruins, it is a cursed place, the locus of ghost stories told in hushed tones. They speak of the tortured souls of his victims, still wandering the empty corridors, and of a vast fortune buried somewhere beneath the crumbling foundations. It is no longer a physical threat, but a psychic wound on the landscape, a permanent reminder of a power so brutal and absolute that it now seems to belong to the realm of myth. The fortress was never a home. It was a diagnosis written in steel and stone. Every watchtower was a symptom of his paranoia, every hidden vault a testament to his insecurity, every opulent hall an attempt to silence the memory of his own impoverished origins. It was a structure built to project permanence by a man who knew on some primal level that his power was a fleeting and illegitimate fiction. The ruin of the house is simply the external manifestation of the ruin that was always at its core. Its abandonment is the final verdict. The state did not convert it into a police academy or a museum to the spoils of war. Such an act would have granted it a continued meaning, a form of immortality. Instead, it was left to be unmade, to be slowly devoured and forgotten, its history dissolving back into the dust from which it was raised. The greatest insult to an empire built on the performance of power is to be deemed, in the end, completely and utterly irrelevant. The fate of the man now mirrors the fate of his creation. He is confined to a cell, his world reduced to concrete walls and a barred window, a final ironic echo of the fortress he built to control his own reality. The ranch is equally confined, its perimeter now defined not by armed guards but by the encroaching desert, its vistas sealed by the slow creep of vegetation. Both the creator and his creation are entombed, monuments to an ambition that built a kingdom but could never purchase peace. The colossal effort, the billions of dollars, the rivers of blood, all were invested in the construction of this alternate reality, this sovereign space designed to hold back the world. But the higher the walls were built, the more they amplified the owner's fear. The deeper the bunkers were dug, the more they resembled a tomb. The fortress was a desperate, colossal defense against the one enemy that could never be defeated, the persistent, internal ghost of being powerless. Perhaps what we build says less about our power than about our fear of being erased. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, Subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.